Page for week 3 in the primeval narratives and patriarchs. When we talk about primeval narratives, in case you were wondering what that is, we're primarily referring to the material that makes up Genesis 1 through 11, which is probably my favorite. Just about, there's a couple other pieces I'm pretty partial to as well, but just about my favorite piece of the Old Testament, especially within Genesis, because there's so much material that lends itself to some of the things that we've been looking at as far as comparison to other ancient Near Eastern pieces that you were looking at last week. So one thing that you might have noticed is a jellyfish, or it looks like a jellyfish, right? This is the drawing of the cosmos. I did not draw this. Mine would be far worse than this, but you can think about it as a jellyfish. So if you go over to that section, actually I'll probably put this up on the screen as I'm talking about it, but you have this division of waters, basically. You have a primeval ocean, you have these waters above, there's a firmament, this hard material surface that actually keeps those waters above at bay from crashing back in on the earth below, which is exactly what happens in the flood narrative later on. So the ancient Hebrews, they were no exception, along with Babylonians and Assyrians and everyone else at that period of time, for the most part, thought of this kind of tiered universe in this kind of format. And you'll notice there's a sun depicted there, and probably like a moon and some other heavenly bodies that are kind of floating there along the firmament. And then you have an underworld in this conception. In the Hebrew conception, this would actually be something like Sheol, or Sheol, you might see. We'll talk about that later on. But this is the general makeup. Now you hear this depicted absolutely perfectly in Genesis 1. When you read through that on your own accord, you have this God who is separating the waters above from the waters below. And what does that God do it with? A firmament, this hard dome-like structure that keeps the waters at bay. And then, of course, like we mentioned later on in the flood narrative, the floodgates of heaven literally open and the waters above come crashing down the earth below. That's part of their cosmology. That's how they understood that. It made sense. So, anyway, having said that, there's a few things I want to touch on from Genesis 1, and then we're going to recap on some of that next week after I kind of hear your thoughts and you get a chance to kind of engage with that material a little more. One of the things that I ask you to do is to read Genesis 1 and 2. I say it like that because there are very few people actually read straight through that material. And your book is going to point out that there are 2 creation stories, or accounts, or myths, or legends, traditions, whatever you want to call them, that are found there. And they have a little bit different things to say about humanity and God. And one of the questions is kind of which one you're drawn to, and this is part of your assignment. So you can reflect more there, and like I said, we'll recap it next week. So I'm going to put up on the screen a transliteration of the Hebrew. What that means is kind of like what the Hebrew words themselves sound like, so that we can talk about this phrase. So typically, Genesis 1:1 begins with, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." This is that kind of reflection of Christian theology, which is typically labeled ex nihilo, or out of nothing. So God creates everything kind of out of thin air. But there is another way to translate this, and you'll see a footnote if you go to, say, Bible Gateway, or you're using a good translation that's going to let you know there's a little bit different way to read this. So the transliteration of Genesis 1:1 can read, "Bereshith bara Elohim et hashamayim u'haaretz." Now what that says is, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, or that B in Bereshith, which is the first word, that kind of means at the head of something, at the start of something. And that B, the ba of Bereshith, can be translated in, with, or by, or when, a kind of a temporal kind of clause. So another way to translate this, and what you'll see a lot of footnotes in many Bibles read, is when God began to create the heavens and the earth. Now that doesn't seem like a big deal, but we're going to get a little bit further into that. The second piece to that reads, "U'haaretz hiya tohu wahavohu w'hoshek al pnei techom." Or, and the earth, she, because everything, of course, in Hebrew has some sort of gender association. The earth is feminine. And the earth, she was formless, void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. Now that last word, tehom, your book is going to make a connection to that I want you to pay attention to. It's going to call back something you read last week, namely a cognative tehom, or the deep, as a lot of translations put it, Tiamat. So, Genesis 1 is absolutely, as is the priestly strain, that source, obsessed with order. Everything is created at a particular time. There's days upon which things are split up and created into. There's this very orderly account of creation, things flowing day to day, piece by piece, so that life develops. And the pinnacle of that creation, of course, ends up being humanity, which is created male and female at the same time on the sixth day. That's Genesis 1. So that begins to make a little more sense when you read, I'm going to suggest, Genesis 1:1 in this fashion. When God began to create the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. So there's this situation that God comes to where there's this formless, deep darkness. That's what the word hoshik means. It's almost a word that's difficult to interpret because it means this just utter, endless, deep, chaotic darkness was upon the face of the deep. Now, tehom, deep, that word, Tiamat, is kind of like this symbol for chaos that Marduk, in the story that we read last week, the Babylonian creation epic, deals with. And you'll remember Marduk actually does kill Tiamat and cleaves her, splits her in half, and kind of fillets part of her to form the waters above, the waters below, the sky. So it's kind of a very similar idea, at least, to the way the cosmos is set up in Genesis 1:1. But anyway, you have this God coming onto the scene, and what there is day by day by day is this continual ordering of this chaos. All right, so there's these divisions that are put in place. There is the water above separated from the water below, so that the sky can be. There's this void where sky can be, and birds are going to fill that void. And then there's the ground that's able to surface after the waters are kind of told where to be. And after they're divided up, dry land can form, and then you have, of course, plants that can form, animals that can form, and finally humans that can form. So this continual order actually makes space and room for life. That is a huge deal in the first creation narrative. And then you see that order, which creates this room for life, go away later when we read the flood account. Because what happens? In the firmament, the floodgates open, the waters above come crashing back into to that space. What happens? Chaos through water is reintroduced, and it takes away this space for life. That's kind of part of the priestly platform in a nutshell. So we're going to skip ahead to what we have in Genesis 2, which is a little bit different take on creation. By the way, this being the priestly account in Genesis 1:1, that's where you have, of course, Elohim used over and over for God, which is you're just going to see translated G-O-D, G, usually a capital G, little o, little d. When we get to Genesis 2, and you can read this for yourself, you're going to see capital L-O-R-D, which is again going to signify that you're reading a Yahwist account for the most part, most of the time, at least in this section, which is going to use the Tetragrammaton, or the divine name, Yod He Vav He, the YHWH, for the name of God. And you have a little bit different kind of perception or understanding of God there, a little more almost kind of personal, intimate account. I'll let you look at that. But you have man actually created first, and then there's the other creatures that are brought into the picture, and then lastly, kind of Eve is created, let's say, or the female character in this piece. Now, one thing that you might miss if you're reading through this quickly, though this actually works well in English, so a lot of you may have already seen it. You have in Hebrew the word Adamah, which means earth, and then the word Atham, which means man. So there's a play on words that's going on where you have Atham, man, taken from the Adamah. And we turn this into kind of a particular personal name, Adam, and it kind of functions that way in the story. And you have a similar situation with Eve, which means something like mother of living things, this kind of life force. and we turn those into kind of personal nouns for the story. All right. So I'm going to jump ahead quickly to keep this brief to a document that is saved on the on your assignment sheet. It is entitled The Flood Narrative, J&P Division. Now this is a piece that splits up in a very accessible way, I think, some strains so you can look at a division of kind of the four-source hypothesis, the Deuteronomistic, the priestly, the Yahwist, and the Elohist accounts. You're familiar with those from the other week. But this splits the flood narrative in Genesis 6:1, basically, to chapter 8, verses 22, into those sources. So this is a work, actually, that a former professor of mine did, as she actually translated this, and it reads in a way that really gets at the spirit of how Hebrew translates. So some of it seems kind of repetitive. That's because Hebrew is very repetitive. So it's very interesting to read like that. It might read a little bit differently from an English translation, and you're free, of course, to check that against those. But you can read the Yahwist on the left and the priestly on the right. The Yahwist, of course, using the tetragrammaton, the Yod, He, Vav, He, YHWH, Yahweh, to refer to God, and the priestly using Elohim, or capital G, little o, little d, to refer to God. And the interesting thing is, you can read both of these accounts straight through, independently of one another, and basically have a complete story. They emphasize different pieces of the character of God that they want to lay out, and the relationship of that God to humankind as well. But this is something that I thought was really interesting and laid out in an accessible way I wanted to share with you. Now, also right before that, there's a piece that a lot of people skip over, referred to as, the characters therein are referred to as the Nephilim. This is in Genesis 6:1 through verse 4. And what you have in that story essentially is this idea of the sons of God who are kind of wreaking havoc on the world below. And your textbook does point out that this is probably some sort of, and it probably does have some sort of polytheistic tendencies that are carried over. But what's interesting about the Nephilim are they're kind of almost like, different traditions refer to this story as kind of like fallen angels. Your book makes a reference to these figures called the Watchers, who are fallen angels in first Enoch. If you've seen the movie Noah, the Hollywood spin on the flood story, they use this tradition to kind of have some what would you call it? Some leeway, some creative direction to form these kind of rock angel creatures. If you've seen Noah, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But their function is to kind of help Noah build the ark and to kind of fend off these attacking hordes that are coming at Noah once the floods start to come. But anyway, that's kind of where part of that offshoot develops and comes from. Now, after the flood, a very interesting thing happens. Noah, he's celebrating apparently, and he plants a vineyard. He gets drunk, and apparently he unclothes himself because he's laid on the ground naked. And one of his sons, Ham, comes walking by, sees his naked dad, tells his brothers about it. They go and cover him up. Apparently the punishment for seeing your father naked is to be cursed, because that's what Noah does to his son Ham. Now what's interesting about Ham, I'm going to put a map up that kind of lays out where Noah's descendants are said to go to. And you'll notice that the areas where the descendants of Ham go to are essentially enemies of Israel, these groups that they're going to do battle with in the future of this narrative. And what's very unfortunate is that this particular text was actually used by slave traders, slave owners, to justify treatment of slaves of African Americans, because they associated these people, if you look at on the map where the descendants of Ham are at, with being lower class, with being the descendants of Ham and therefore cursed. The Bible has been used in destructive ways to justify those sorts of things, and that's one example where it was used to do such a thing. So just pointing that out, because if you're reading other pieces of history that might pop up from time to time, this is a piece that's been used to justify that. Does it justify that? Of course not, but it also does serve to kind of have a one-up or some kind of snipe at some of these groups like Egypt, like Babylon, like Assyria, like Canaan, that the Israelites are going to battle later on, and there's even reported acts such as that of Joshua of genocide against these kinds of people. So, interesting piece. Now, right after Noah essentially curses one of his sons, and you have this descendants list, you have this other piece that pops up your textbook doesn't talk about, I don't believe anyway, which is commonly referred to as the Tower of Babel. Now, the story goes that people were prideful, and they wanted to build this temple to the heavens, and that God essentially doesn't want this to happen and comes down from heaven, where God apparently resides in this kind of structured universe, and confuses their languages. And you have an etiological story, which you're going to look at in your assignment. Kind of it provides an explanation for why things are the way they are now. Right? So what's interesting about the Tower of Babel is the very word itself should kind of give away what the author of this material is kind of getting a kick in at, which is Babylon. The land of Shinar is where this tower is built, which is the land of Babylon. And you'll remember from some of the dates that you checked out last week, 722 and 586 are going to be dates that we try to drill home all the time, because they're what this material is all working towards and has in the back of its mind. 722 is, of course, when Assyria comes through and wipes out the northern kingdom. We're going to talk more about that. That's a big piece of the Old Testament. And then 586 is where Babylon comes through and carries off the southern kingdom into exile, which is a huge, huge piece to remember when you're reading anything in the Old Testament. So these are kind of snipes at Babylon, this proud, arrogant group that has this tremendous effect on Israel's history. The tower itself, there are Mesopotamian temples called ziggurats. And there were these, if you've seen images of Mayan ruins or kind of Aztec, almost square tiered temples that extend upwards, you can think about it like that. That's what a ziggurat was. And they would build these higher and higher. So this is definitely a direct reference to those kind of structures. So very interesting. We're going to leave it at that. There's a lot more in your textbook. There's, tons of material in Genesis. It's impossible to cover it all, but we're talking about a few basic ways to go about approaching that material. And we're going to recap on some of this next week, hopefully, after I get a chance to read some of your thoughts back on that. So if you're interested in hearing anything more, or anything clarified in the next little snapshot we do, just send me an email, let me know, and we'll talk again soon.